Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Extremely excited to be recording my favorite video on the channel. Every single year I record one of these and it really tests my NBA knowledge as we talk about all 215 NBA free agents that will be available this 2024 NBA offseason. If you guys do enjoy the content, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel for more content, and that's right, we're going to cover all 215 NBA free agents this offseason. A lot of work, as you could expect, goes into this video each and every year, where we talk about every single possible free agent, talk about their landing spots, talk about what I could see them getting for a contract. Obviously, there's some big names, there's a lot of smaller names, but a lot of detail goes into this video. So again, I hope you guys do enjoy. Without further ado, let's jump into it here now with a video preview. Not only are we going to discuss all 215 NBA free agents, but I have them broken down into categories. I've got players who have player options that they'll opt into. I've got players on team options where I'll talk about whether or not I could see teams accepting that team option, and I'll break down why or why not I could see that happening. We also have players who are restricted free agents, obviously a very niche subject, and with the new CBA, there's a few new stipulations in that as well we'll talk about. But there are a lot of players on restricted free agent deals. So we'll talk about those quite a bit in this video. We're also going to talk about some of the max contract players. Not as long of a list as you could imagine, but a very important list. So make sure you stay tuned for that aspect of this video. Then we'll look at some of the bigger size contract players, guys who are going to be playing for more than that mid-level exception, but not quite all the way up to that max contract slot. We'll look at some of those mid-level exception players. There's the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is nearly $13 million, and the taxpayer mid-level exception as well, which has a little bit of a ramification for this year and a bit of an adjustment for how it actually operates this season. So keep your ears tuned for that. Then we'll talk about biannual exception players. Some guys that I could see getting that $4.7 million mark this year that teams can use once every other year. Then we'll also look at some minimum contract players. There's a lot of those in this video as well. Of course, not all 215 players are going to be on those bigger size contracts, so it's important that we cover all the small details because those players really do matter when it comes to playoff time. If you get contributions from those guys, that means you had a really good offseason. So we'll see how teams look to operate, but we're going to start with that team option specifically and really look at who could be on the move and getting their team options declined, or who could be getting their team options retained. There's 24 in total. We're going to go by a series of 8. The first one here, the most important one to talk about, this is in descending order, by the way, of contract value, is Bruce Brown, $22.5 million on his team option. Remember, he signed that 2-year contract with a club option with the Indiana Pacers, was traded to Toronto, and that's a big number for the Toronto Raptors, but it is a no-brainer decision to accept that team option. Had they planned to not accept it, they would have traded him at the trade deadline. They instead decided to keep him. The intention here is to ultimately trade Bruce Brown, whether that be this offseason or in the next season. At the NBA trade deadline, they're going to be able to move that $22.5 million expiring contract. This is a no-brainer decision for Toronto, and it's a very good outcome for Bruce Brown as well. He gets another really strong season of pay, making over $22 million a year. I think is very, very, very good for him and the level of player that he is. It's a perfectly good contract for him. He's going to really maximize the last couple of years, turning himself into a lot richer of a player than maybe he would have been in a different market. But ultimately, he gets to go out now, likely get traded again, just like how Indiana traded him this past trade deadline. The Raptors will look to move him either this offseason or into next season at some point. My guess is this offseason, maybe even draft night. Evan Fournier has an $18.25 million team option that will likely get declined. The Pistons have the opportunity to operate with cap space. Evan Fournier, who is constantly an Olympic superstar, when he's got the French national team jerseys on, he's unguardable. But unfortunately, when he's in the NBA, he's not quite as good. So I don't think Detroit's going to be keeping that $18.25 million option on roster. Now, in the event that they did, they could look to trade that. It would be an expiring $18 million deal, but for the most part, I just don't see any reason for the Pistons to actually keep that on roster when they can go out into free agency and actually spend money that way. So Fournier's contract will definitely get declined, in my opinion. Luke Kennard for the Memphis Grizzlies, $14 million. A little rich maybe for Luke Kennard, probably closer to a non-taxpayer mid-level exception player, which is about $1 million, $1.5 million cheaper than that $14 million mark. But for Memphis, a team that already has a lot of money committed, keeping Kennard either as a trade piece or just on the roster as a shooter around their core nucleus of guys, I think is very valuable. I would be surprised if Luke Kennard's option does not get picked up, whether that's for trade bait or for actually retaining him on their roster in their top 8 in their rotation. The Magic have a couple of players here. Joe Ingles at $11 million, Mo Wagner at $8 million. Mo Wagner will definitely get his option picked up. $8 million is a very fair price for him, in my opinion. I think Mo Wagner should be pretty happy with that number as well, but Orlando, I think, is very content in keeping him on that mark. And then for Joe Ingles, $11 million, probably a little rich for him, but I do think Orlando internally really likes what he brings them from a maturity, veteran leadership standpoint. He also brings a toughness into that locker room and on the court. Joe Ingles famously doesn't take anything from anybody. He is somebody who he'll trash talk on the floor. He lets other stars know how it is. Think back to his infamous series against Paul George when the Jazz upset the Oklahoma City Thunder that year. Joe Ingles, I think, just still a pretty reliable player. Obviously, not like he used to be in terms of the overall talent as a starter in the league on a bunch of winning teams. But for Orlando, he's a shooter, brings veteran maturity leadership. I think that they'll probably pick up that team option. If they don't, though, it means that they're really going to look to be aggressive doing something else, whether that's in free agency or in the trade landscape. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Then we have a couple of Houston Rockets here as well, Jeff Green and Jae'Sean Tate. I think with Houston's cap space situation, they don't really have any way of opening up money this offseason to spend in free agency. So it makes perfect sense to pick up both of these team options. If you let these team options go, you're losing about $14 to $15 million of budget on your roster, which makes it harder to trade. You have one less tradable contract or two less tradable contracts in this instance. And because of that, then Houston would have less flexibility. So I expect them to pick up both Jeff Green and Jae'Sean Tate's options. Jae'Sean Tate obviously has been one of the longer-term players there in Houston. He's been on the roster now for about 5-6 seasons. And then Jeff Green, I think they liked what he brought from a maturity standpoint. Played a lot of backup center for them this past year. Now I'm expecting his role on the court to look a little bit different next year with Steven Adams in the fold. And I'm just guessing Jeff Green's minutes are going to go down a bit. But that's okay. Still, again, the veteran leadership is why you retain him. Then Tristan Vucevic for the Washington Wizards had a few highlight reels by the end of the year once he finally got some run in. That will definitely be accepted. $2.425 million. There's no reason for the Wizards to not accept that team option. He will be with Washington next year. Couple more team options here. We got an important one, Vlatko Cancar from the Denver Nuggets. He got hurt last year during Olympic qualifying play, did not play at all for the Nuggets this season, and as a result, not really just blaming their whole season on his injury, but they struggled with depth this year after losing Bruce Brown. Some of their young guys just maybe weren't ready or didn't take the steps forward that everyone wanted to see. Having someone like Vlatko Cancar could have had a huge impact on their season just from a depth perspective. So getting him back at $2.27 million, going to be super team friendly. That option gets accepted, as does Delano Banton, $2.1 million as well, will get accepted. Garrison Matthews, a little bit of a trickier one, doesn't have a real role there in Atlanta, and this team is penny pinching right now. The Hawks, from a cap space perspective, are really, really tight on the dollar. I do think that they'll accept this Garrison Matthews contract because it is relatively cheap, just a little bit over $2 million. It's hard to find another player who, even for league minimum contracts, some of them come up to $2.5–3 million, depending on the player's experience in the league. Garrison Matthews at $2 million and a little bit of change, I think, is going to get accepted ultimately for Atlanta, who's watching every single dollar they spend. Isaiah Joe making under $2 million, as is Sam Hauser. A couple of these shooters are on really team-friendly contracts. The Celtics are now up 1-0 in the NBA Finals. Sam Hauser, I think, got to showcase that he's a better defender than most people would expect when you first look at him. I've been a big fan of Hauser's for a while now. I've really loved Isaiah Joe for a while coming out of Arkansas. I just liked his game a lot. He gets better each and every year. The Thunder and Celtics both easily pick up these options, no questions asked. Jericho Sims, fun fact, I actually played Jericho Sims in high school as my final ever high school game. He knocked me out of sections. We went to overtime, ended up throwing down like 4 straight dunks because he's 6'10", super athletic. I could see the Knicks picking up this option, but they also have 2 picks in the first round at 24 and 25. So it kind of depends on what they plan to do with those. If they plan to trade those picks out, maintain future trade flexibility, then picking up Sims' option as a 3rd, 4th center on the roster is not a bad idea, especially given some of their free agents they could lose this offseason depending on how the market shapes out. We'll talk about some of those guys later. Sims is really like a wild card here, because if the Knicks plan on picking at 24 and 25, Jericho Sims easily becomes someone who is not necessarily in keeping. So that really kind of hinges on how they play this whole situation out. Jose Alvarado of the New Orleans Pelicans, $1.7 million. That option is going to get picked up. JT Thor, a little bit under 1.7. That option will probably get picked up as well. Charlotte, new management, new regime, everything, new owners. Could see JT Thor maybe going, but for $1.7 million, he's super cheap. They'll keep him, I think. Couple more team options, the final 8 here. Aaron Wiggins of the Oklahoma City Thunder. This is a Sam Presti masterclass. We just keep seeing Oklahoma City Thunder on here. Not only Aaron Wiggins, but also Lindy Waters III, another shooter. Aaron Wiggins, kind of a do-it-all player for them. Someone who I haven't highlighted enough on the channel. I do like the way he plays. I like the toughness, the grit, the willingness to get on loose balls, both as a rebounder and someone who just seems to be in the right place at the right time. Aaron Wiggins, a good player, one of the best contracts in the league, $1.6 million for his services, no-brainer. Chimezie Metu for the Pistons, I could see them declining. I just don't really see a role for Metu going into next season. $1.4 million doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're a team like Detroit trying to make a run here in free agency, moving off of Metu to save that just little tiny bit could be what you need to win a negotiation when it comes to signing a player out in free agency. So expect Metu to probably be done in Detroit. Even though his option's super cheap, I could see them moving off of him. Jeremiah Robinson Earl, I do think that contract, that option will be picked up, $1.4 million. The Pelicans do not have an extra first-round pick this year. They have their own at pick 21. They don't have an extra one because they decided to not use that Lakers one. This year they pushed it back to next year, so I think the Pelicans will have a roster spot available here for JRE. So for that reason, I think that they will accept that team option. Daquan Jeffries, I think the Knicks will not pick up that team option, $1.36 million. Now, if they do, again, it's super cheap. I can't really blame them, but I'm not sure how he factors in long-term there. Stanley Umude, for the same reasons I talked about with Chimezie Metu, I just don't really see Umude getting real play time in Detroit going into next year, especially when they try to enter phase 2 of their rebuild where they want to actually, win 25 to 30 games in a season. Umude will not get picked up. Again, they're going to go out into free agency, spend, add veterans. They already traded for Simone Fontecchio. I just don't think the minutes are there for Umude anyway. So the Pistons maybe keep him on a 2-way contract, but they will not sign him or will not pick up this team option. Jeff Doughton of the 76ers, I could see them picking up this option, $1.16 million. The Sixers right now have 3 guys under contract, I believe, and obviously Tyrese Maxey will be a 4th. We'll talk about him later in this video. The Sixers need as many bodies as they can get right now on their roster, so Doughton at $1.1 million basically doesn't cost against your cap at all, essentially with how small that number is. So I could see them keeping him, but if they decline it, it also wouldn't be shocking to me because, again, just like I talked about with Detroit, teams that are lining up for cap space, you don't want to pick up options on some of these guys who don't factor into your rotation to begin with. Nehemiah Queta for the Boston Celtics, they will for sure pick up this team option. The Celtics are one of the smartest organizations in the world. Queta, I think, could be a very good 3rd center. Obviously, he hasn't gotten a lot of run, hasn't gotten a lot of play time, but for Boston, a team that has older bigs with Al Horford and an often injured big, with Kristaps Porzingis, just having an extra body is always good, and look at how cheap he is. The Celtics are littered with high salary contracts. Jaylen Brown, the richest in NBA history. Jason Tatum's going to sign an even richer one this offseason. Drew Holiday just got extended. Porzingis got extended last year. Derek White's in line for an extension. The Celtics are going to be expensive, so cheap labor like Nehemiah Queta is a must keep. One more player I needed to talk about here is Chris Paul, someone who has a non-guaranteed contract currently with the Golden State Warriors for $30 million, but it is completely non-guaranteed. So if he is waived before June 28th, the draft is, by the way, June 26th or June 27th, depending on which day you're looking at, first day or second day of the draft. Chris Paul, if he's waived one of those days or beforehand, is owed zero money by Golden State. Now, the Warriors are in a tricky spot because if they do waive him, that means they lose that contract as a trade asset, and it is a $30 million expiring contract. So they could theoretically look to trade him instead of waive him. And some other team could either then just use his contract and eat it for a season, or they could try and use it in a trade themselves in the future. So this Chris Paul situation is very important to talk about. Very different than a lot of the other scenarios, because Chris Paul probably can still play some winning basketball. He's not a starting point guard anymore on a championship caliber team, anything like that, but he is a floor general still, has good ball security. He's able to run a ton of pick and rolls. He's super smart. He's been around a lot of players who have developed well with him around, not crediting him solely for their development, but Jonathan Kuminga really found himself playing alongside Chris Paul and with Chris Paul this season. You look back at Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, think about Phoenix and the real turnaround that organization had once they got Chris Paul. He's just been around winning. And I think Chris Paul, there is something to winning players, guys who value every possession, guys who just are really cerebral about the game. And I think Chris Paul is one of those players. He would be a perfect fit in San Antonio. He would be really, really great for a lot of different teams. So I think Chris Paul could find an actual landing spot this year, whether that's as a free agent. He would probably be playing for really, really cheap, maybe even the minimum or something close to it. But I do think Chris Paul is just still flat out a valuable player, a useful player, someone who should still have a roster spot in this league. And I could see the Warriors flat out just keeping him on that $30 million contract, not for themselves, but as a trade asset to send him somewhere and use his contract as a trade chip. So that's important to talk about here as well. There's a lot of places Chris Paul could still play and have an impact. I think San Antonio is really at the top of the list, though, as a potential landing spot. So keep your eyes on that. Definitely something worth watching for, but I had to include him in this video. Let's talk about some of those restricted free agents now, and I'm very excited for this portion of the video because there are some very high quality restricted free agents out in this offseason. Tyrese Maxey of the Philadelphia 76ers is really at the top of the list. His cap hold is significantly less than what his actual contract is going to look like. So when we get to free agency, don't be shocked when Tyrese Maxey doesn't sign an extension for the first couple days. The reason for that, Philadelphia will push off signing Tyrese Maxey. They're going to retain onto his cap hold. Maxey will not take any meetings with other teams, and what will in turn happen, the Sixers will spend up their cap space on other players, and then they will extend Tyrese Maxey to a contract much bigger than his cap hold. Both sides get very happy. Maxey gets a max contract after the fact when Philadelphia has already spent their other cap space numbers on other pieces, other players, whether that be a collection of role players, whether that be a third star, and then maybe another high quality player in addition to that. The Sixers are lined up with a lot of cap space this offseason. Tyrese Maxey is their first most important piece, but they're going to push off signing him until the end to maximize their leverage in their window this offseason to add more talent onto their existing roster. Immanuel Quickley will be back in Toronto. He's another restricted free agent. Obviously, the Raptors viewed him as a key piece in that OG Anunoby deal. I think the best piece that they got back in that trade was Immanuel Quickley. He will be in Toronto for a long while, so expect him to sign probably a 4-year deal with the Toronto Raptors, inking him to the franchise for the foreseeable future on a pretty big number. I think some fans are going to be shocked at how big that number ends up being. It's going to be a big number, okay? I'm talking $100+ million, guaranteed, no questions asked about that. Patrick Williams of the Chicago Bulls, there's going to be a real market for him this offseason, and the Bulls might lose him. The Bulls are kind of in a tricky spot. I think a lot will hinge on what happens with Zach LaVine and his contract, obviously one of the bigger contracts in the entire NBA, and I think with the way that this offseason could go for LaVine, where he gets potentially salary dumped, if they find a way to salary dump him, it makes it a lot easier to retain Patrick Williams. But if they're unable to find a real suitor for Zach LaVine, someone that will take in his contract, the Bulls might risk losing Patrick Williams to a team like Oklahoma City, who has cap space, or San Antonio, who has cap space. Even Utah could maybe get involved, even though they already have a bunch of big front court players as it is. Patrick Williams, I think, still someone who hasn't lived up to where they picked him at, 4th overall, but someone who still has some value around the league, and I could see a few teams looking at him and really addressing that need in free agency. Someone like OKC, again, right at the top of the list, and then the Bulls, there would be some pressure on them with some of their other free agents and their current cap table on if they can actually afford to keep Patrick Williams or not at, say, $15 to $20 million a year, which is a pretty hefty price tag. Isaac Okoro of the Cleveland Cavaliers, he will be back in Cleveland. I am like 99% certain on that, unless some team came in with a gigantuan offer that I am not expecting here. He'll probably sign back with Cleveland for a pretty nice price tag, maybe something like 4 years, $80 million, but he will be back in Cleveland long term. Obi Toppin, funny, I wrote of the New York Knicks. You guys know I meant Indiana Pacers. That is hilarious. All right, that should be all fixed now. Obi Toppin of the Indiana Pacers, and he will stay there in Indiana. As you can tell, a lot of work goes into these videos. I spend a lot of time trying to make everything perfect. A slip up every once in a while might just happen. But Obi Toppin, I think, showed a lot in the playoffs for the Indiana Pacers. I was extremely excited for Indiana when they acquired him. I thought he was a perfect fit into their play style. I would love for them to even leverage him more as an on-ball screener, something he did a ton back with the Dayton Flyers in his college days. Now they do that quite a bit. Obviously, Tyrese Halliburton is one of the best pick-and-roll passers in the league, and Obi Toppin has so much rim gravity and athleticism to maximize that as well. He's a really good player, and I think with the postseason he just had, he's going to make a good deal of money. So a lot of congrats to Obi Toppin, one of my favorite players to watch in the league just from an athletic standpoint and an entertainment standpoint. And I think he did a nice job this year for Indiana, mostly off the bench. Obviously, he kind of started with that starting role, lost it throughout the year, especially once the Pascal Siakam trade happened. Didn't have that same role, but I think he moved back into a more appropriate role for himself. Simone Fontecchio of the Detroit Pistons, he'll be back in Detroit. The Pistons gave up what ultimately became pick 31 for him. Very good deal, I think, for the Pistons, who already have so many young players. I don't think pick 31 is as vital to them as a player who actually fits their roster construction. Simone Fontecchio, who is 27 years old right now, so he's a little bit older. Still restricted free agent status, though. The Pistons do a good job maintaining him on their roster. Hopefully it's not for a huge number. Something between $7 and $12 million, I think, is pretty fitting. Hopefully you get him closer to that 7, 8, 9 number. It's probably one of the better contracts in the league if you're able to get that done. Precious Achiuwa of the New York Knicks, I have him as a higher quality restricted free agent because he's actually played real NBA minutes and has been impactful in those minutes. Even saw some playoff time this year. I think Achiuwa is a pretty solid big man, probably a respectable third big there in New York. I talked about Jericho Sims being your fourth big man. That would be with Precious Achiuwa being your third behind both Mitchell Robinson and Isaiah Hartenstein. Now there are some trade rumors around Mitchell Robinson. Who knows what will actually happen there? He's often injured and his contract's pretty good, but with the Knicks kind of upcoming cap struggles and some of the extensions that they're going to owe some of these players, maybe they would move Mitchell Robinson, making Achiuwa and Jericho Sims a little bit more important from a depth perspective as well. Now we get into a long list of restricted free agents because there are 77 restricted free agents in totality. Let's fly through some of these. I'm not going to sit and talk about every single one because this video would be 4.5 hours long, but I am going to share some thoughts. For the Pistons, they have James Wiseman, Malachi Flynn. This is not in team order, by the way. This is just kind of whatever order I put them in, and we'll just talk about them as we go. Trendon Watford for the Brooklyn Nets. I do like Trendon Watford's game. Kind of a face-up four-man, can handle, can pass a little bit. The shot's still a little streaky, but if he ever really dials that shot in from behind the three-point line, he could be a very, very good low-value contract, or low-cost contract, in the league. Sandro Mamukelashvili, I like his passing, I like his feel. Not sure if he's ever going to be good enough defensively to be a mainstay in a front court playing heavy minutes, but for a 13th, 14th guy right now, definitely worth having on the roster. AJ Lawson, the Dallas Mavericks, doesn't really matter to me too much in terms of where he ends up playing. Kessler Edwards for the Kings, I do think a solid young forward. His brother Cameron Edwards is actually viral on TikTok. He's one of the bigger TikTokers from 2023, 2024, so funny enough, that's, I guess, somehow ties into something here. BJ Boston for the LA Clippers, someone who I still think has a lot of potential to grow into. I watched him work out in person this year. I got to see him play in person. Pretty impressive frame, shot making. The handle, I think, is legit. Now it's just about putting some of that together more consistently, really building on those reps to become a just better overall player. Max Christie of the LA Lakers, probably the best player on this list. I do think he'll be back in LA with the Lakers, and I do think he'll actually start to get rotation minutes at some point over the next couple of years. Admiral Schofield of the Orlando Magic doesn't really move me a ton, neither does the Lester Quinones of the Golden State Warriors. Dominic Barlow of the San Antonio Spurs does move me, though. Super athletic big man, and if he ever found a way to get himself on the floor. I do think he would impress as a pick and roll player. As a big man, I think if the Spurs do go with someone like Nikola Topic in this year's draft, or if they go with maybe someone like Rob Dillingham who has some real scoring gravity, Barlow as a backup big man who is super athletic and an above the rim finisher, I think could find some like real success in like a Dwight Powell type of role. I'm not saying that Dominic Barlow is going to be an awesome big man or anything, but I'm saying he could be a really dynamic roller, finishing above the rim, especially on lobs. Luka Garza for the Minnesota Timberwolves actually got a standard NBA contract this year. As a result, has restricted free agency status. I think he'll be back in Minnesota. I think the Timberwolves staff really likes him. Usman Garuba of the Warriors, kind of a talent grab here for Golden State. Defensively, he is someone who really shows a lot of versatility. Now, the big problem is offensively, he's just not very good. So there's a lot of moldability defensively with him. I'm not sure if he's ever going to find a real opportunity in the NBA, just given how his career's kind of shook out so far. But a former first-round pick, I think Golden State probably retains him for now. Jordan Goodwin, Memphis Grizzlies. He's been bounced over around the league a little bit. Was in Washington, Phoenix, now in Memphis. I could see him sticking in Memphis, though, as a depth backup guard. Ashton Hagans for the Portland Trailblazers. Probably not an NBA caliber player, to be honest with you. But he's got a handle. He can play make a little bit downhill. I'm not really sure the Blazers need a ton of guards, but he's on the roster. Malik Williams to the Raptors, probably not going to stay in the NBA long term. Pete Nance, I do think will stay with Cleveland for a while. Jacob Toppin will stay with the New York Knicks for a while. Brother of Obi Toppin, funny enough. Chuma Okeke for the Orlando Magic, former first round pick. Just not really sure he factors into their long-term plans. And Kyra Lewis Jr., another first-round pick, got traded a couple of times this year. Got traded to Toronto in a 3-team deal, part of that Bruce Brown trade we've talked about already in this video. And then ultimately got dealt to Utah along with a few other pieces. I think pick 29 was in that for Kelly Olynyk. Kyra Lewis Jr. probably not going to be a key piece for Utah going forward either. Other restricted free agents, Daishen Nix, not a good player. Point blank. Daishen Nix probably should not be in the NBA. Trevelin Queen for the Orlando Magic should be in the NBA on a two-way contract or an end-of-the-bench spot. I do think he belongs. Ty Washington, I think, belongs as well. I think he'll actually be a pretty important young player for Milwaukee. Not saying he'll ever be a 25, 30-minute per game guy, but he can handle the ball in the pick and roll, and I think just playing with the Wisconsin Herd a bit and being kind of an end-of-the-bench or G League affiliate type of player for them could be very valuable when it comes to either complementing their other young talent that they look to implement over the next couple of years through second-round picks, so on and so forth. They have pick 23 in this year's draft, I believe, so adding in some talent that way. Jerome Robinson, actually a pretty impressive workout to watch in person. Obviously, his time at Virginia Tech, he was a real shot maker and shot creator. Now, in the NBA, he hasn't been afforded that play style. Not sure he's ever going to really get that opportunity. So Jerome Robinson, probably just back on a two-way contract or an end-of-the-bench spot with Golden State, if I had to guess. Justin Minaya, Nate Hinton, not really moving the needle a ton for me. Nate Hinton, I do like his rebounding as part of a Rio Grande Valley Vipers. He's just been a long-term G League player at this point now, I believe 3 or 4 years. I could see him sticking in the G League and continuing to impact winning basketball at the G League level. Keon Johnson, highly athletic guard. Feels like the Brooklyn Nets just keep grabbing every athletic first-round pick guard that hasn't worked out in their last spot. They have Dennis Smith Jr., they have Lonnie Walker IV, Keon Johnson. Not sure that any of them are going to find super high success in the NBA, especially not Keon Johnson, who has some real deficiencies as a scorer, ball handler, playmaker. But I do like Keon Johnson long-term as like a, hey, keep him, see if you can slowly develop some of his areas and make him your 12th, 13th guy. And if you need someone in a pinch, he at least has some athleticism and prototypical size to play. Xavier Moon for the LA Clippers, I mean, okay. Jordan Ford for the Sacramento Kings, another one I'm like, okay. Some of these don't move me a ton. Like, I know all of these players. I talk about them a lot. I watch a lot of G League games, way more than I should. And this is how I know I'm like an unhealthy basketball person, because I know all of these guys. And honestly, like, so just to be honest with you, I don't want to sell you guys crap and say, oh, this guy could change the future. No. Like, some of these guys just, they're depth pieces at best. Dylan Windler for the Atlanta Hawks. Now, this guy, Dylan Windler, had a crazy game for the Westchester Knicks this year. where he set like a rebounding record, and he's a 6'5" guard who's a shooter. It's unbelievable to me. I actually really liked him as a pickup for the Cavs when they drafted him a few years ago. Didn't ultimately find success there, unfortunately, but I do think he actually is worth a two-way spot or a kind of fringe like 13th, 14th guy on your roster spot. Ibu Baji is one of the worst players in the NBA this past year. Should not be on a roster, to be honest. He has really zero feel for the position and just wasn't good. So I don't think Ibu Baji should be back in Portland. Good chance he will be, though. Drew Peterson for the Heat. Could see him staying in Miami there. I really like the Heat's collection of affiliate players and two-way guys that they've had this past year. David Duke Jr. I do like a lot, actually. Really athletic, has a pretty nifty handle. Henry Drell for the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls were very active, especially at the end of the year with some of their G League call-ups, making a few different moves. I actually met the former GM of the Windy City Bulls, no longer with the team, with the G League affiliate, but Henry Drell was one of his guys. So I know Drell probably sticks around there in Chicago for a while. I think he has a lot of built-up kind of support in that organization. Brandon Williams of the Dallas Mavericks, he's bounced around a little bit, was with Portland last year, got signed to Dallas late in this season, I believe in December or so. But I think the Mavericks like him as kind of a fourth guard on the roster. Probably stays on a two-way contract, kind of ebbing back and forth between the Texas Legends and Dallas Mavericks. Dwayne Washington Jr., someone who I still think can play in the league. Probably, again, a 12th, 13th guy. That's what a lot of these restricted free agent statuses are. This is how you know you're a basketball sicko, though. If you're enjoying this part of the video, that means you guys are sickos, so congratulations. Alundis Williams of the Miami Heat. This kid has an excellent crossover. If there's anyone on this list, which is why he's pictured on the graphic, if there's anyone on this list that like blossoms into a really, really darn good player, my bet would be Alundis Williams. I like his game still. I liked him coming out of college. I think that with the right development system, which he's now with the Sioux Falls Skyforce and the Miami Heat, you could really turn him into a good player. So I think Alundis Williams is going to be a name to watch for sure from this list. Jacob Gilyard for the Brooklyn Nets, just too small. I got to see him live in person this year for the Memphis Grizzlies. He's too small, to be honest, and it's unfortunate. You know, he's been probably told that so many times in his career. That's probably the first knock on all of his scouting reports that everyone shows him. It's a bummer, but it's just kind of the reality. Quentin Jackson for the Indiana Pacers. I don't think for Indiana, who has already so much depth, not sure how he really factors in there long term, to be completely honest. Some more restricted free agents. Ish Wainwright for the Phoenix Suns. Wainwright has actually played a lot of NBA minutes. I think probably one of the better restricted free agents out there from just a positionally sized physicality strength standpoint. He has an NBA body, which is going to keep him on a roster probably for a while. Saban Lee, I don't think is an NBA player. To be honest with you, I don't think he should be on a roster, especially with the influx of talent in this year's draft. A bunch of guys who I think are going to be qualifying for two-way spots and end-of-roster spots. Saban Lee might be on the way out. Darian Sebron, a player I like a lot of downhill juice, a lot of athleticism. I think surprisingly a pretty good handle now. His feel for the position isn't elite, but he can be an offensive generator just from his presence getting to the rim and creating paint touches. I do like Darian Sebron quite a bit. Jared Rhoden for the Detroit Pistons. Again, Pistons, we've talked about them a bit. With the influx of talent they're likely going to add this offseason, I don't see Jared Rhoden ever finding a way into a consistent rotation spot, but maybe he does stay on Detroit's roster as a two-way guy. Jalen Slauson will definitely be a two-way guy again next year for Sacramento. Isaiah Wong and Oscar Tshiebwe I could both see being back with Indiana, especially Tshiebwe. I think Tshiebwe's one great trait is his rebounding. That is something that, you know, doesn't sound super sexy, but it's important. And for the Mad Ants, he was one of the most prolific rebounders in G League history. So Tshiebwe will definitely stay with the Indiana franchise and maybe even just maybe someday get real playing time with the Pacers. Probably not likely, but you never know. You don't want to rule it out. Colin Castleton of the Lakers, definitely could see him staying with the South Bay Lakers for a long-term situation. Isaiah Mobley will stay in Cleveland with the Cavaliers, probably playing more for the Canton Charge, but I do think Isaiah Mobley will stay on their roster. Seth Lundy, a movement shooter out of Penn State last year. I think he'll stay with Atlanta. Moving forward, Emoni Bates, one of my favorite players on this list. You guys know I never sold my stock on Emoni Bates from where he was as a high schooler to where he was his freshman season with Memphis. Everyone wanted to point out the flaws, the discrepancies, the problems in his game. I still think this kid could be a really good movement shooter, has a lot of good length to him, not from a wingspan perspective, but from a general positional height perspective. I think Emoni Bates does have an NBA career ahead of him. Keontae Johnson for the OKC Thunder, probably could see him sticking around as a two-way guy there. J.D. Davison will be a two-way guy for Boston next year if I had to guess. Adama Sanogo will stay in Chicago next year as well if I had to guess, but I could also see, depending on who the Lakers hire as their next head coach, I could see someone like Adama Sanogo going over to the Lakers, if you catch my drift. Amari Bailey for the Charlotte Hornets will definitely be a two-way guy. They spent a second-round pick on him. They like him, so he'll be in Charlotte. Charlie Brown Jr., could see him in or out. Not exactly sure what's going to happen with him, to be honest. Jay Huff will likely be back in Denver next year. Jay Huff's been a really good G League player for a while. Hasn't really gotten the NBA tick that maybe he would love to get, but I could see him staying in Denver as a functional third, fourth backup center on probably a two-way contract. Braxton Key for the Nuggets as well. I mean, maybe stays in Denver. I could see that being a case. Moussa Diabate for the Clippers. He will be back in LA. The Clippers have a couple of other big men who are free agents this offseason. Moussa Diabate, super athletic, not very accustomed to playing NBA basketball yet. Obviously doesn't have the feel for the position as much. But I do think with his athletic traits, the Clippers will hold on to him. Then Micah Potter for the Utah Jazz probably will stay as well. A good G League player, probably another two-way guy staying in the fold. And then our final collection of RFAs. Again, if you guys stuck with me through the restricted free agency portion here, which is quite long, 77 players, you guys are real ones. If you're watching this part of the video right now, comment basketball sicko down below, because in that way I know you guys stuck with me here. Jermaine Samuels of the Houston Rockets, Jonathan Williams of the Houston Rockets. I think Jermaine Samuels will definitely stay with Houston for the next couple of years, and then Jonathan Williams has been bouncing around the league a little bit, played a little bit with the Portland Trailblazers in the NBA last year. He's not an NBA talent, but he definitely is a G League talent. He'll be on some roster, whether it's Houston or some other team, I'm not sure, but I do think he will be on a roster as a two-way guy going into next season. Kevon Harris will be on probably the Lakeland Magic again, if I had to guess. Jamal Cain, Cole Swider, two guys again. I talked about Miami having a really nice collection of two-way guys, a really nice collection of end-of-the-bench players. Jamal Cain, Cole Swider both fit into that. I like what Miami has from a two-way perspective, from a young player perspective. I think, these guys aren't going to be future stars, but I think there's going to be important traits that these guys have that can get them on an NBA floor at some point in time. Greg Brown III for the Dallas Mavericks, super athletic, not really good at basketball, but again, super athletic. The Mavericks might be slated to lose Derrick Jones Jr. this offseason. Greg Brown III has similar traits to Derrick Jones Jr., not as good of a basketball player, obviously, but has similar traits. Maybe that makes him an important two-way guy for the Mavericks to maintain going forward, but they do have Omax Prosper. They still have Josh Green. They have a bunch of other young players that maybe would get the nod over Greg Brown III to begin with. Olivier Sarr, brother of potential first overall pick Alex Sarr, was with the Oklahoma City Thunder this year. I actually watched him a couple of summer leagues ago with the Phoenix Suns summer league team. Olivier Sarr can play. He is a really huge, massive human being, and he can protect the rim. He's the one featured on the graphic here. I actually like Olivier Sarr quite a bit. I think he could be a third or fourth big on a roster. Again, that might sound like ludicrous saying you like him a lot. You think he could be a long-term reserve. Like, I get how that sounds, but being a long-term reserve in the NBA means you're pretty darn good at basketball. So I think Olivier Sarr, someone who's pretty good. I think his rim protection is legit. I think he could actually play NBA minutes from time to time. Now, OKC, obviously their play style doesn't really fit someone like Sarr, who's more of an inside big rim finisher, so I understand why he doesn't have a real role there in OKC, but I could see them keeping him on the roster as well, just because he offers things that they don't typically have from the position. Terquavion Smith of the Philadelphia 76ers. This is one of your favorite player to watch, probably, because he is a bucket getter. Now, he's super low efficiency, but he'll be back with Philadelphia on a two-way contract probably next year. Here we are now. You guys stuck with me through the restricted free agency portion, or so I hope. Now, here are the maximum contracts, or close to the max. So some of these guys might not sign the full max, right? But they'll be really, really close to that number if I had to guess. So here's the list. It's, again, much shorter than those restricted free agency numbers, but they're a lot more important and a lot better. LeBron James, and this is a testament to LeBron. He's going into his 22nd season in the NBA, and out of everyone on the list, he is still the headliner because he continues to put up numbers every single year, and he continues to play winning basketball. And I think as his career even ages going forward, like even if he takes slight regression steps every single year, he's still going to be really good for quite a while. So LeBron to me is just a freak human being, probably the greatest player to ever play basketball from a longevity standpoint, from an actual talent perspective as well. I know I'll get pushback from some Jordan stands there, but Michael Jordan's career was significantly shorter than LeBron James's, and the back end of his career was ridiculously less impactful. So a lot of credit to LeBron. Where do I think he could go? Cleveland would be a real option. Maybe Philadelphia. I wouldn't even rule that out. But ultimately, I do expect him to be back in Los Angeles with either Dan Hurley or J.J. Redick as the head coach. But by the time you're seeing this, it's very likely Dan Hurley is the coach of the Los Angeles Lakers. And here's a little bit of a disclaimer. I love that for LA. That would be a fantastic hire for them. And, you know, some people are going to question how he's going to translate to the NBA game. He's been coaching like an NBA coach for the last couple of years at UConn. He's going to be tremendous. Paul George for the Clippers. He is probably the biggest flight risk on this entire list. He is going to take real free agency meetings. If I had to guess, he will likely meet with Philadelphia. That's going to be the main team he is linked to and rumored to. Another team I would not rule out here with his player option, if he doesn't stay in LA on either an extension or opting into that contract, he could find his way to Orlando. I think that is a real sleeper team to watch for. Could Orlando make a run at Paul George, make a really dynamic wing grouping of Paul George, Paulo Banchero, Franz Wagner? What things could they learn from Paul George with his creative play style, his handle? Obviously, you see all the TikTok edits, I'm sure, as well. Anytime I scroll on TikTok for like 3 minutes, I swear I get a Paul George edit. So, he's a fun player. But he's also just a really good player. And I know people are going to point to some of his shortcomings. He's still really good. And the Magic, who need a little bit more shot creation, I think a little bit more floor spacing, Paul George fits both on and off the basketball in that regard. James Harden will stay with the Clippers. I think that is one of the most foregone conclusions. He and Ivica Zubac have a very good relationship off the floor and on the court. They have built a really good chemistry. I think that's going to be one of the most important factors in Harden staying with the Clippers, is not only his relationship with Zubac, but I also think he and Kawhi Leonard get along very, very well. When I was able to be in their locker room this year, he was sat right next to Kawhi Leonard. And the two of them were chatting very consistently, almost constantly, it seemed like. So Harden and Kawhi have a pretty good relationship, it appears. It looked like Kawhi was having a lot of fun this year playing with James Harden. I think that Harden will be back in LA regardless of whatever happens with Paul George. But there's a good chance, I think, PG-13 and Harden are both back there in LA to start next season. Pascal Siakam will stay in Indiana. That's the biggest foregone conclusion. He's going to sign a huge extension, a lot of money in it, but Pacers fans, he's worth it because you already traded 3 first-round picks for him. You almost have to extend him. I think the organization has already come to that conclusion that they will. They wouldn't have traded for him if they didn't plan on doing that extension. So Pascal Siakam will be with Indiana long-term. OG Anunoby, he has a player option. He will definitely opt out of it. There is a rumor right now that he will take free agency seriously, and there's a lot of teams that would love to have him. Oklahoma City would pay this man a huge bag to get him because he would be one of the perfect missing pieces there. Super athletic, functional dunker, spot sitter, great cutter, good baseline operator, fantastic defender, good shooter. OG Anunoby would be perfect in OKC. He would be perfect for basically any team that wants to get him. He's going to have a real market, but ultimately I think the Knicks max him out, keep him, and he'll stay there with CAA. In what seemed to be a foregone conclusion, he would have re-signed when they traded for him. It's a little bit up in the air right now, but I do think he ultimately lands back in New York. Now we get into some of those bigger contracts, some of those sizable contracts that aren't quite max contracts. And at the top of the list here is Klay Thompson of the Golden State Warriors, who is going to sign something similar to what Draymond Green signed last year. I believe Draymond signed a 4-year, $100 million contract. I could see Klay getting a bit more than that because his shooting's a little bit more valued around the league. Maybe something like 4 years, 110, 4 years, 120 million, something in that ballpark, giving him between $27.5 to $30 million a year probably. And the Warriors let Klay, Dre, and Curry play out the remainder of their careers together in what is one of the latest feel-good stories in NBA history. Typically, championship teams don't stay together this long, so to see Steph, Klay, and Draymond spend their entire careers together would be very poetic, and honestly something I am rooting to see. DeMar DeRozan to the Chicago Bulls, one of the most important free agents. I don't know if he'll sign a real max, but I think he'll sign something very, very large. Maybe like 4 years, 130, 4 years, $140 million. So a little bit south of that max contract. Maybe look at what Drew Holiday got with Boston. DeRozan could be in line for something similar to that to stay there in Chicago. If he doesn't stay in Chicago, maybe the Clippers would be involved. If they were able to effectively sign and trade Paul George to open up a trade exception, that could bring in DeMar DeRozan. That's an important thing to watch for. Nick Claxton of the Brooklyn Nets. He will get paid, and presumably will get paid by Brooklyn, who would be really, really distraught if they lost him for nothing. He's an unrestricted free agent. Something like 5 years, $125 million, 4 years, $120 million. Somewhere between that $25 to $30 million mark is what I expect Nick Claxton to get. Look at the Jarrett Allen contract, size it up a little bit for NBA inflation. That's the type of contract you're looking at. Fans will freak out when he signs it. They're going to say, oh my gosh, that much money for Nick Claxton. It's because most of the people commenting that have not watched a Brooklyn Nets game in some time. Nick Claxton's really good. He would be a potential Defensive Player of the Year candidate if Victor Wembanyama didn't exist and if Chet Holmgren didn't exist, because those guys are going to start to dominate that award probably. But Nick Claxton's really, really good. And I think Brooklyn needs to keep him, and they likely will. Malik Monk for the Sacramento Kings. Unfortunately, they only have early bird rights on him. I believe the maximum they can offer him is 4 years, $78 million. And that reality probably shrinks his market down a little bit in terms of what his overall contract might look like. Because if you're a team like San Antonio, who cough, has $21 million in cap space, if you offer something like 4 years 90, 4 years 84, something that fits into that $21 million mark in that first year, you're likely able to get Malik Monk without having to break the bank, because Orlando can't even match that offer because of some of the restrictions that they have on early bird status and not having cap space. So Malik Monk likely headed somewhere else. I've talked about Orlando a lot with him as well. I think that would be a really good landing spot. But the Spurs also make some real sense. Malik Monk, people don't know this, but he's one of the best drive and kick players in the league. So he could be tremendous in a number of spots, but especially around Victor Wembanyama, I think he could be really, really darn good. And I think his shot creation would also be very valuable in Orlando, like we talked about with Paul George. Malik Monk, a little bit quicker, maybe a little bit snappier getting into some of those spots, I think could also find some real success there on the East Coast if he decides to take his talents across the nation. Isaiah Hartenstein for the New York Knicks, one of the most underrated players in the league, extremely good big man, the best center on the Knicks roster. And I don't say that jokingly, I say that legitimately, even though I think Mitchell Robinson, one of the best offensive rebounders in the league, is really good. I think Isaiah Hartenstein's fantastic. So I think he'll stay in New York. I think the Knicks will pay him probably something like 4 years, $80 million. That's a pretty good payday for a player who has predominantly been a backup center at this point of his career. One of the biggest mistakes in Clippers history was not keeping Isaiah Hartenstein. So they chose John Wall over Isaiah Hartenstein. That has not aged very well for the Clippers. D'Angelo Russell as a player option for the Lakers. Honestly, I don't know what to expect with D'Angelo Russell. I would not give this guy a huge contract. I would not give this guy a large contract. I would not give him a long-term contract. But I could see the Lakers keeping him. At times he was very essential for them when LeBron James was out this year. So if they look at those games and say, well, where would we be without him in that? Then they could look at themselves maybe not even making the play-in, right? Where, in my opinion, when you do have LeBron, which is how you need to build your roster, because if you don't have LeBron in the playoffs, you're not going to win anyway. If you don't have LeBron, the team doesn't matter around it really too much. So to me, I think D'Angelo Russell is movable, and you need someone who can actually perform in the playoffs consistently. D'Lo has not done that at this point of his career, and for that reason, I think that the Lakers would be best suited trying to figure something else out at point guard. Obviously, if they had gotten Kyrie Irving last year, that would have worked out a little bit better for them, in my opinion. KCP for the Denver Nuggets. He has a $15 million player option. Whether or not he opts into that, that's yet to be seen. He could opt in and then extend, or he could just flat out decline it and then get a bag this summer. The Nuggets, who are already a second apron team, they're up against the financial component here, but they have to pay KCP. He's their best perimeter defender. They're going to be forced to keep him and pay him. I could see him signing something like 4 years, $80 million as well, getting a very big payday. $20+ million a year, I think, is right in the ballpark of what he's going to be asking for. Then Tobias Harris for the 76ers. I'll see him getting more than the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, anywhere from about $15 to $18 million, I think, is just for what he will likely search for and ultimately get in free agency. I could see Detroit being the team to give him that, although there's other teams out there that maybe would wonder what they would have to pay to get him. And Tobias Harris, he has positional size, shoots the ball decently well, obviously kind of no-showed in the playoffs this past year again, but Tobias Harris will probably get, like D'Angelo Russell, a contract north of $15 million and maybe a little bit south of $22 million. I think that's fairly fair to expect, honestly. Then we have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. I'm super excited for this one as well. That is $12.859 million. So pretty solid, sizable contract here, and there are quite a few players I wanted to highlight that could be in line to get this. Miles Bridges of the Charlotte Hornets, first name that really comes to mind, has a lot of off-the-court stuff, legal issues that have kind of dampened his career and dampened some of the noise around him and the excitement around him, but he has been a numbers guy for quite a while for Charlotte. Now, you can question the impact on winning. You can question what his actual value is on the basketball floor when you are playing with a certain style. But he does a very good job attacking closeouts. He does a very good job finishing above the rim. Super athletic. Could see him signing somewhere for this $12.859 million mark for sure. Buddy Hield and Gary Trent Jr., two guys that I think could maybe get more than this number if they were sought after by a team with cap space. But realistically, both of these guys are going to be sought after by teams that are already in the tax or not in the tax, but looking to be competitive teams. So Buddy Hield probably around that mid-level exception number. Had he not had the playoffs he just had, if he performed better in the postseason, probably would be getting more than this. But the reality is he just did not shoot the ball well when the lights were brightest. So Buddy Hield probably not going to get a huge contract after his first playoff performance wasn't super elite. Gary Trent Jr., I think the Raptors ultimately do keep him. Buddy Hield, I think, is one of the more fascinating ones, by the way. I just don't know if he's going to be back in Philly or not with how they're going to try and operate with cap space. They could just flat out renounce their rights to him and then maybe even bring him back on the mid-level exception, which is weird. I don't know if a team's ever done that in NBA history, by the way. So I don't even know. Buddy Hield's like a unique one, and I think he'll have like a pretty long list of suitors because teams always like shooting. Jonas Valanciunas for the Pelicans. I'm not sure he'll be back in New Orleans. The Pelicans could really look to upgrade at center, whether that's through the draft or through a trade. There's been a lot of noise around New Orleans hunting and searching for big men and point guards. So we'll see what happens with Valanciunas, but I do think some team would be willing to give him the mid-level exception here, maybe like a 3-year, $37 million contract, something like that. Malik Beasley played on the league minimum last year for Milwaukee after a really bad playoff showing for the Lakers. Clearly, he was better than the minimum. Started a lot of games for Milwaukee, was super essential in them being an elite half-court offense to start the year. Then Doc Rivers took over. That completely crumbled and fell apart as he put Malik Beasley to the bench behind Patrick Beverley. Can't say that was the right decision. But Malik Beasley should be playing 25 minutes a night or so, and he'll probably make around this mid-level exception number. Remember, too, it's important to note, teams can split up this mid-level exception. So if you don't want to give all $13 million of this basically to a player, you could pay them $8 out of this number. So that's where Malik Beasley could maybe sign for $7, $8, $9 million. You save a little bit of money on it, but you're still using that mid-level exception to sign the player outright. Caleb Martin for the Miami Heat, he has a player option around $6.8 million, I believe. He is better than that $6.8 million price tag. He will opt out and likely get something north of $10 million annually, if I had to guess. Talen Horton-Tucker of the Utah Jazz, another guy I could see getting paid on the mid-level exception, but splitting it, maybe like $7 million, $8 million. Could see him signing with a team for 3 years, $24 million. Something similar to that, where you're using, again, that mid-level exception to sign the player, but you're not completely breaking the bank and using all of it in one transaction, which is what I would see for someone like Talen Horton-Tucker, to be completely honest. Then we go into our next list of non-taxpayer mid-level exception guys, and this list, I think, just, again, quality players who are worth paying, and we're on the same topic, that $12.859 million. Tyus Jones of the Washington Wizards, he is probably worth the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception as a backup point guard, extremely valuable. Very safe, strong, steady with the ball in his hands. He's not going to turn it over, constantly around the top of the league, if not at the top of the league in terms of assist-to-turnover ratio. Kyle Anderson for the Minnesota Timberwolves, I think the best landing spot for him is a reunion with the San Antonio Spurs. He's a really good passing forward. I think could really maximize Victor Wembanyama's rim gravity, size, and his ability to finish as a play finisher. I think Kyle Anderson would be a really natural pairing with Victor Wembanyama after playing with Gobert for a couple of years, going on to play with Wemby, who's a lot more talented offensively, a lot more skilled, has better hands, better finisher. I think Kyle Anderson could really work some magic with Wemby as a roller. DeAnthony Melton, probably one of the better sweepstakes targets this offseason. If you get him anywhere from $8 million north of that, all the way up to that 12.859 number, he could be a really valuable get because he's a very good defensive guard. Now, he has been dealing with a back injury. Obviously, the concern here is you have to medically clear him, because if you're concerned about the way he's going to be able to perform and play going into future seasons because of some of his injury history, then it becomes a big red flag and you're not sure you can sign him or want to sign him. So that's something that I don't have the medical information on. I don't want to speculate too much, but from who he actually is on the floor, he is worth that money for sure. Derrick Jones Jr., talk about playing yourself into money. He has done exactly that for the Dallas Mavericks. He has been essential for them. One of the best league minimum signings in NBA history, probably. Not very often do you pay your starting small forward the league minimum and make it all the way to the NBA Finals. That is just extremely rare. That almost never happens, but his athleticism, defensive ability, especially really just maximizing that defensive capability, his transition, lob threat, finishing. For a long time, I've liked Derrick Jones Jr. Now, I never thought of him as a starting small forward on an NBA Finals team, to be completely honest with you, but I always thought with his athleticism, there's some role that he could fill, and he's done that for the Mavs. He's hit a lot of corner threes. He's attacked closeouts well, specifically going to his left hand. He's very left-hand dominant as a player, but he's been really essential for Dallas. Not sure the Mavericks are going to be able to retain him. He's going to have a pretty strong market, if I had to guess, so I think he'll be a very good get for whoever does land him. Anywhere again between that $7 million mark and that $12.859 million mark. Kelly Oubre will probably sign for nearly the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception. Pretty big payday for him, but something that after playing on a cheaper contract this year for Philadelphia, he has probably earned. And then Markelle Fultz, he was playing on about $17 million or so this year for Orlando. I think the postseason and just some of the issues throughout the regular season where he's getting guarded by centers showcase some of the problems with him making that much money. To me, I don't even know if I would give him the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, but I could see a team being willing to do that because former first overall pick, still athletic, still someone who can make plays off of a live handle. There are things about Markelle Fultz's game that are enticing, so I could see him getting paid by one of the 30 teams decently well. Now we get on to the taxpayer mid-level exception and the biannual exception number, and again, this is where the basketball sicko in me comes out a little bit. These are guys who are going to be making either $5.22 million with the new taxpayer mid-level exception number, which has actually drastically dipped from last year, where it was about $6.6 million. And then the biannual exception number is $4.7 million. Now, important note, your team can only use this exception once every other year. So, for example, in 2022, the Sixers used their biannual exception on Daniil House Jr. Because of that, they couldn't use the biannual exception last year in 2023, but they can now use it again in 2024, just as an example here. Some players I could see signing for this number, $4.7 to $5.2 million mark: Gary Harris of the Orlando Magic, Alec Burks of the New York Knicks. I'm sure some people will say, whoa, Alec Burks is way better than that. Yeah, I don't believe that, but I mean, maybe. I went back and forth with Alec Burks. Could he get more than 5.2? Maybe, but I just don't really know if I see that. Royce O'Neal of the Phoenix Suns, I think, fits perfectly into that taxpayer mid-level exception for some team. Nick Batum definitely fits into that taxpayer mid-level exception or the biannual exception number for Philly if they want to keep him. Basically, these numbers to me are like, hey, this guy's definitely better than a minimum contract guy, but he's either at a point of his career where he wants to win and has already made a lot of money, or he's not as consistent as some of those non-tax mid-level guys. So that's where you find a lot of these guys. Like Nick Batum's already made a lot of money in his career, probably values winning over a paycheck. So with that, Nick Batum, I think, just makes more sense in this $5.22 million mark. Chris Dunn and Taurean Prince, I think Taurean Prince just was playing on, I believe, the taxpayer mid-level exception. Could have been the biannual exception. I don't exactly remember the language in his contract. I should maybe look that up just so I'm refreshed before free agency live streams. But he was playing on roughly this size of contract this past year. The more I talk about it, the more I think it was the biannual exception, but we'll see. Chris Dunn, one of the better defensive guards in the league. I could see him actually having some real value to contenders as a backup guard, like your fourth guard off the bench. You got your two starting guards, you have your probable scoring guard off the bench, and then maybe Chris Dunn's your fourth guard behind that. That's where Chris Dunn, I think, could be really valuable to a team. Spencer Dinwiddie for the Lakers. What a decision he made, by the way, skipping out on the Dallas Mavericks to go to LA instead. Can't say that worked out super well for him, but I could see him in line for one of these exceptions. If he doesn't sign one of these, then he's just flat out a minimum player. But to me, I do think he is better than a lot of the other minimum guys. So even if he doesn't get it this offseason, which I think is very possible he doesn't, I do think he's better than those guys that are also playing on the minimums. Goga Bitadze, really underrated year for him. Honestly, stepped in and played really, really well. I could see him getting the taxpayer mid-level exception or the biannual from some team if it's not from Orlando, just keeping him on a contract similar to this using bird rights. Jalen Smith from the Indiana Pacers, he has a player option for $5 million. At the beginning of this season, I talked about him getting the taxpayer mid-level exception. Pacers fans thought I was crazy. Well, and then he got played out of their playoff rotation, and I think we saw some of the flaws in his game that make him not a non-taxpayer mid-level exception guy. I could see him just flat out opting into that player option, or I could see him maybe signing with a slight raise on bird rights from the Pacers, something like that, where again, he's not going to be making a full $10 million. I think anywhere from like $5 to $7 million is right in his price range that makes some sense for a front office to consider and do. Haywood Highsmith, a good player, someone who Miami probably needs to factor in trying to keep long-term in that $5.2 million mark, probably where you see it. Now, defensively, one of the better defenders in the league, extremely versatile, quick hands, gets a ton of poke-aways. Offensively, not reliable enough to be a non-taxpayer mid-level guy. So that's where you're seeing some of these guys making 5.2 to 4.7. It's just because there's a few flaws in their game that prevent them from being that $12.859 million guy at that non-taxpayer mid-level exception number. Now we jump into some minimum contracts. Again, this part of the list is quite a bit longer, so bear with me here, but I'm extremely excited for it. Kyle Lowry of the Philadelphia 76ers, Gordon Hayward of the Oklahoma City Thunder. These are some of my higher priority free agents at the very top here, Lowry and Gordon Hayward. I know Hayward did not play well with Oklahoma City. Honestly, that was pretty surprising to me. I thought he was a pretty good pickup for OKC at the trade deadline. Just ultimately did not work out. Never really found a rhythm. Didn't stay healthy as much there. And I just think wasn't in shape to play the style that they played and wasn't ready for that style either, surprisingly. So Hayward, though, I do think in a change of scenery could find some real success. Remember back a few off seasons ago, everyone thought Nick Batum was terrible and washed, and then he went from playing for a bad Hornets team to going to a contending Clippers team, and it looked like his career was revitalized. I think Gordon Hayward can have that similar kind of revitalization in a smaller role, lesser minutes, and kind of a more respected player in some ways, being on a better team. Kyle Lowry, I think, will stay in Philadelphia. Super important for them. McDermott, I could see staying in Indiana, but he'll play for the minimum instead of like the $7 million he's been playing on. Robert Covington for the Sixers, I really thought about him as a possible biannual exception guy, but the minimum, especially with how many years experience he has, that means he'll probably be making like $2.5 to $3 million. Like, it's not that far off from the biannual exception number, and I think he would probably be willing to stay in Philly for the minimum at that price tag. Cedi Osman for the Spurs, could see him staying in San Antonio. I'm not really sure where he would get valued, but he's going to be a minimum contract guy. Clippers, here's their couple of big men, Mason Plumlee, Daniel Tice. I don't think either of them are consistent enough at their age to be warranting more than the minimum contracts. Like, it felt like this year Ty Lue kept toggling between both of them because he couldn't really decide which one he liked more, and he couldn't really decide which one actually added more value to them as a backup big man. I think just both of them are minimum contract players. I could see them both staying in LA. LA is a pretty cushy lifestyle. It's a pretty nice place to live. Could see Plumlee and Tice both staying there with the Clippers. Campaign for the 76ers, could see him staying in Philly as well. But I could also see him weighing all of his options. He signed a minimum at the beginning of the year with Milwaukee. Campaign minimum level player, right? So Jordan Nwora probably re-signs for the minimum in Toronto as another shooter off the bench for them, probably a depth shooter. Xavier Tillman, depth big man for Boston, probably re-signs there. If I had to guess, based on them giving up a couple second-round picks, I think they would like to keep him on a cheap, affordable number going forward. More minimum contract guys. Andre Drummond, I think one of the more high-impact minimum players you can get. Maybe one of the most high-impact minimum contract players in league history. Obviously, he's cashed in already in his career, but the last couple of years he's been playing on minimum contracts. And he still rebounds the ball at an elite level. It feels like once a year he's due for a 20-plus rebound game. Doesn't play high minutes. Obviously, still not a super great player. Doesn't impact the game as a winner as much. But rebounding is still valuable, still important. I could see a team valuing Andre Drummond's rebounding and his presence, especially in the Western Conference when you have to deal with a lot of big bodies. I think maybe a team in the West could look to pay Andre Drummond as a backup big man for sure. Justin Holiday for the Nuggets probably stays in Denver. Was a valuable off-the-bench piece for them, especially in the second half of the season. And in the playoffs, he shot the ball relatively well, especially against Minnesota. Patrick Beverley probably stays in Milwaukee. Now, he does have a suspension that he has to serve at the beginning of the year based on how his season ended with the conflict in Indiana. But Beverley is a player who Doc Rivers is going to want back, and honestly, his play style is essential there in Milwaukee with how they use Brook Lopez defensively in deep drop coverage. You need screen navigation. You need someone who wants to defend. Patrick Beverley, that's his player DNA. Jay Crowder likely back in Milwaukee as well for the minimum, or some other team that is looking for a depth piece, maybe Philadelphia. You never know, right? Some team could view Jay Crowder as a nice 9th, 10th, 11th guy. The one place I'll guarantee you he's not in is Detroit or wherever Monty Williams is coaching, because he does not like Monty Williams very much. Dennis Smith Jr., probably back on the minimum contract somewhere, probably not in Brooklyn if I had to guess. But I could see him going to a number of different teams, contending teams, non-contending teams. Dennis Smith Jr. should have a market, former lottery pick, super athletic, defensive-minded guard. I think his defensive numbers really stand out to me every time I look at them. Lonnie Walker IV, he'll have some interest around the league as well. I think he'll ultimately stay back in Brooklyn for a minimum contract. Monte Morris probably stays in Minnesota on the minimum. I just didn't understand trading for him at the deadline. They needed more shooting. They needed like a wing who could shoot. They didn't ultimately go that direction, and then ended up losing to a team that shrunk the floor on them because they didn't have enough shooting around Edwards and Gobert. If they just loaded shooting around those two guys, they could have had one of the best pick and roll combos in the league. They didn't do that. Instead, they were playing Kyle Anderson and Jordan McLaughlin in Game 5. So that's how it went for them, unfortunately. But Monte Morris probably back in Minnesota. He has a relationship with Tim Connolly, who is staying in Minnesota for at least another year, it seems like. Aaron Holiday for the Houston Rockets. Could see him staying in Houston. Now, the Rockets do have a top 3 pick. Maybe they would spend on a guard. Maybe that shapes how Holiday would fit long term. But Holiday actually gave them some pretty good minutes this year off the bench. Dario Saric for Golden State. Could see him staying in Golden State. Not really too certain. There are minimum contracts here too for Cody Zeller, Alex Len, Garrett Temple, JaVale McGee, Tristan Thompson, the Morris twins, which is crazy that they're at this point of their career. It just feels like yesterday that they were drafted. Reggie Bullock, DeAndre Jordan, Mo Bamba. These guys are all either old or not very good. So they're going to be out of the league either this year or next year, maybe playing on minimum contracts one more time. One player in here that I think could actually maybe play a little bit in the NBA still is Reggie Bullock. Fits as a 3-and-D wing, could be like your 9th guy in a rotation, play 10 minutes and guard for a little bit, and just spot up and catch and shoot a little. Like, he's not going to be great, but he'll play a little bit. Not too long ago, he was the starting 2-guard on a Western Conference Finals team, which is ridiculous. More minimum contracts: Udoka Azubuike, Damian Jones, Thanasis Antetokounmpo, who will be back in Milwaukee. Definitely no nepotism there. That's one of my favorite things when people freak out about Bronny James getting a combine invite, but they don't freak out about Billy Donovan's kid now coaching the Windy City Bulls. They don't freak out as much about Thanasis having a roster spot in Milwaukee. Like, what are we doing here? Svi Mikhailuk actually scored a point in the final. Shout out to Svi Mikhailuk. I think he could be back in Boston. The Celtics love shooting. Mikhailuk shoots the ball really well, but like, if they moved off of him, I wouldn't be like, oh no, the sky's falling. Luke Cornett will be back in Boston. Every time I watch Luke Cornett, I'm like, God, this guy's pretty good. Like, he's not a starting center, obviously, but I think he could be like a low-quality backup, which, again, it doesn't sound like I'm super praiseful for these guys, but low-quality backup big man on the minimum is, like, valuable. So Luke Cornett, definitely could see him sticking around in Boston on the minimum. Moses Brown, just not very good. I love his rebounding numbers, but he just has zero feel defensively in the pick and roll. He doesn't know how to guard. To be completely honest. Bol, I still think there's some upside here. And I'm not one of those Bol like believers that sits here and says, oh my God, he's just as good as Wembanyama. Nothing crazy like that. But I do think Bol is like unique enough that you could do some things with him. Like, if you put him in the game and have him play like top of the key zone defense, which sounds crazy because most people would probably put him in the paint as a rim protector in a zone, or they'd have him guarding a corner. Like, I think put him at the top of the key. He blocks a lot of 3-point shots, and it doesn't matter if you're running a zone. It doesn't matter as much if he gets blown by that's where, like, and then you could have him leak in transition where he's actually really dynamic. He's a good transition scorer because he's super long and athletic and gets downhill pretty quickly. Like, that's where you could find some real success with Bol Bol. So I think if some team took a waiver on him, again, I wouldn't be mad about it. I would love to see him in San Antonio. Just like put Bol Bol on the floor with Wembanyama behind him and have Bol Bol leak out in transition all the time. It would be pretty fun. I'm not even going to lie. And, I'm not sure that any teams actually ever do that, but it would be fun to see. Jordan McLaughlin, not a very good NBA player, shot the ball really well this year, but teams don't guard him. He has zero shooting gravity, zero scoring gravity, and as a result, his playmaking is just far less valuable. So he'll be back in Minnesota. The Timberwolves love him. Chris Finch loves him. He'll be back with the Wolves, but I'm just not that high on him. Harry Giles, not going to really move the needle if he's on a team or not. I don't really care too much. More minimum contract guys. We have Danilo Gallinari, DeLon Wright, Mike Muscala, Patty Mills, Trent Forrest. I do want to highlight Trent Forrest here for the Atlanta Hawks. Quinn Snyder likes him. Obviously trusts him quite a bit. Had him in Utah with him, brought him to Atlanta as well. Trent Forrest will probably be back in Atlanta next year, especially with the guard controversy for the Hawks of will they have both Trae Young and DeJounte Murray going into next year. Obviously they have Kobe Buffkin kind of in wait. I think that Trent Forrest likely is on the roster going into next year. Shake Milton, I could see him back in the Knicks. Doesn't really move the needle for me. I could see him back in Philly as well on a minimum. If in case they don't keep Campaign, I could see Shake Milton being their minimum signing as like a backup guard behind Tyrese Maxey and Kyle Lowry and whoever else they sign in free agency. Taj Gibson, hopefully not in the league next year, to be honest. TJ Warren should not be in the league next year. Javonte Green should be in the league and should be on the Bulls because it just seems like he plays way better in Chicago than anywhere else in the league. Isaiah Thomas, probably not on a roster next year, but if he is, he'll probably be in Phoenix because the Suns are kind of a joke. More minimum contracts. Thad Young of the Phoenix Suns. Don't really know if I see a spot for him. Lucas Shamanich, he'll be in Utah still. I think that they like the long-term outlook that he has as a shooting big man. Lamar Stevens for the Memphis Grizzlies. Lamar Stevens athletic. Not much else. I think he'll probably start to get phased out here soon. Anthony Gill should not be in the league, but that's partially why I think he'll still be a Washington Wizard next year because they're intentionally losing. So Anthony Gill might just be still back in Washington, but he's not very good, to be completely honest. Kendall Brown of the Indiana Pacers. I actually do like his long-term profile. Super lengthy, switchy defender. Now, there's not a lot of minutes to go around in Indiana, but I do think he'll be back on some form of two-way contract for them next year. KJ Martin of the 76ers probably back on a two-way contract for Philly, if I had to guess. James Johnson for Indiana might just retire. He is quite old, but he is obviously an enforcer type of player. Not really sure there's a lot of value in that in the league anymore, but he obviously brings some mental toughness to Indiana. So credit to James Johnson for that. Bismack Biyombo, Oklahoma City Thunder legend Bismack Biyombo. Maybe he's played his last NBA game. I'm not exactly certain. We also have player options to talk about and some opt-ins as well. Guys who I think will opt into their contract. Rashawn Holmes for the Wizards, $11.6 million. He will opt in. These are guys who are not going to pass up on the money. Some of them are pretty obvious. I'm not going to spend too much time on. Some of them I'll explain a little bit. PJ Tucker, $11 million. That's an obvious. Gary Payton II for the Warriors, $8.7 million. I think just with how the market is shaping up this year, he needs to opt into that contract and get his money's worth now. Reggie Jackson, over $5 million here, probably closer to a minimum level player at this point of his career. He has his moments, obviously, but I don't think he's a great backup point guard. He should opt into that $5.125 million mark. Russell Westbrook, if he opts out, the best he'll get is a minimum. He should opt in and get nearly $4 million this year from the Clippers. Kevin Love, nearly $4 million. He'll opt in with the Miami Heat, if I had to guess. Now, maybe Kevin Love will have a little bit more of a market, and for a player like him who would, his minimum contract would be like $2.5–3 million, like I talked about earlier. If he opted out, it would just because he wants to change of scenery, but I'm not sure why he would want to leave Miami. I think the Heat would be just fine with keeping him as well. A little bit under $4 million, probably will opt in. Now we get a list of some Phoenix Suns signings as well, where again, signing guys for the minimum with player options typically doesn't age too well, and you're going to look at how some of these have aged. Eric Gordon for the Phoenix Suns, he'll opt in $3.3 million. Josh Okogie, Damian Lee, they'll both opt in for the Suns. Josh Richardson, a Miami Heat player option, $2.97, he'll opt into that as well. Then we got some more player options in here. Thomas Bryant, he'll opt into his $2.7 million. Torrey Craig for the Bulls will opt into his, I would have to guess, $2.7 million. A few more Phoenix Suns here. Yuta Watanabe, got traded ultimately out to Memphis as part of the David Roddy deal, but $2.5 million, he'll opt in, get his money now. Drew Eubanks, $2.5 million, he'll opt in with Phoenix by the end of the playoffs. He was out of their playoff rotation, but as a backup big man, I think he's going to want to stay in Phoenix and get paid this season. Keita Bates-Diop, another Phoenix Suns signing, got traded this year. Again, not surprising. He was part of the Royce O'Neal trade, I believe. $2.5 million. He'll opt into that contract with Brooklyn. The Lakers, a bunch of minimum signings. Jackson Hayes will opt into his $2.3 million one. Cam Reddish will opt into his $2.314 million player option as well. And then O'Shea Brissett will opt into his $2.314 million player option. Actually played some meaningful minutes this year for the Celtics. Not super impactful, but more of a hustle guy, more of a glue guy there when he does get on the floor. So O'Shea Brissett probably opts in. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.